Hi everyone, it's Sarah Porter. Today we're going to discuss Ava Feder-Kittay's writing, which goes over women's relationship to communitarianism from a feminist perspective. I found it super interesting, so hopefully you guys did too, and we can have some good discussion in the comments section. So to start off, she talks about communitarian ideals and how they are created more for the benefit of men than for women, because there's an emphasis on collective well-being, which means that we have to forfeit some freedoms and rights of individuals, and women can't really afford to forfeit those rights because they had to claim them in the first place. So like the right to vote and like equal right in the workplace, which is still like a work in progress, but those types of things that we had to claim for ourselves that men didn't necessarily have to claim, so they might have an easier job giving them up where we had to fight for them in the first place. She then goes into the idea of new communitarians versus like old communitarians, and how new communitarians focus more on social justice, equality, democracy, and being responsible for children equally, and how the individual cannot be sacrificed for the community in the same way. So the communitarian platform wants childbearing to be applauded rather than denigrated. And when I read that, I was kind of intrigued to see like what you guys' opinions were about what that looks like in today's society. So do we like denigrate the idea of having a child still, or is that kind of like old news? So just something to think about when you write your responses. Should there be laws about like bringing your baby to work, paid leave for fathers and mothers, that kind of thing. So she also says that divorce should not put an end to responsibilities. That you should still like have the freedom and the right to divorce your spouse, but you should still be completely obligated to your children and spousal well-being. So then she gets into the idea of gender roles, saying that the old communitarian view was to strengthen relationships within the family. She says that in some way there has to be gender roles to be upheld because women are like more nurturing and men have specific child-rearing responsibilities that women can't provide. So thinking of gender roles in more like a complementary form instead of putting one above or below the other. And I was interested to see what you guys thought on that. Like, are there things that a child lacks if they're raised by a single parent, if they're just raised by like a woman or two women, or a man or two men? Like, does a woman and a man have to be present for the child to live like a fulfilled childhood or like get the full experience? I'm not sure exactly where I stand on that, but I think it would be interesting for you guys to talk about. Then Kittay moves into how feminism is still finding a place in political parties and has faced pushback from both sides, though the left is usually more accepting and understanding of their beliefs, and says that she notes that communitarians were involved in policymaking for the Clinton administration, which is good for feminists. Then Kittay moves into her main point, which was the public ethic of care, and she talks about how basic needs for all people include protection of themselves and their property from violence and appropriation. And but we also have an innate need for other people, and it's completely inevitable. Our needs surpass others at certain points in our lives, like when we're super young and when we're super old, and if you like are disabled or something like that, like your needs take priority over the needs of your caregiver. At that point, your caregiver becomes a dependency worker. So she says dependency workers are usually women, which leaves them very vulnerable in society because they have to take care of another person on top of taking care of themselves, and usually that person gets the higher priority. So women are vulnerable because basic resources are based on an access to income, and dependency workers usually don't have that access to income because they aren't able to have a job on top of taking care of their dependent. So they're usually at the mercy of somebody else. So she basically breaks it down into two possibilities. You can either like have a husband or like someone else to provide for you and be completely dependent on, or you can work and then it's basically, she argues that that's kind of impossible to do both. So she says that you're foregoing some social citizenship, and you're also giving up like your right to work. So just wanted to hear you guys' thoughts on her breakdown of that and whether or not you think people can do both at once, like be completely a dependency worker for another person and have a job, or whether you think it's impossible. So then Kittay moves into dependency and women's equality, and she argues that as long as dependency work is done by majority women, which it is, and as long as the work is at the expense of the dependency worker or the dependent, women cannot be equal to men or to one another. And then she says, when relationships end, many men think it's okay to abandon their responsibilities for a child, where women rarely do, because the moral responsibility is so ingrained in their mind. So then Kittay moves into social cooperation. She talks about how we need to figure out a way to show reciprocity to caretakers, and she comes up with a term called dulia to talk about that. So she says serving can be broken down into like a positive thing, like instead of like usually people think of serving as like a negative thing, like being a servant. But you can talk about like a physician being like serving like people who are hurt, or being a servant of God, being of service to the poor. Politicians often say that they're public servants. So just wanted to hear you guys' thoughts on those differences, and are there any? Is it always a negative thing to be a servant, or is it usually more of a positive thing, and should people start thinking of it differently? Then Kittay moves into what it exactly means to like create reciprocity. So she kind of starts talking about stuff that was brought up with Rawls, which I thought was kind of interesting. She said part of reciprocity for the dependency worker would be caring more about children, because she brings up that like 1 in 5 children lives in poverty, and that should mean something to us. So raising the significance of the children raises the significance of caregivers. And you guys, I was wondering if you guys thought that children are still like undervalued in our society. Like, do you still think that that's a big issue, or do you think that like now 15 years later we're caring more about children? She moves into talking about people who benefit from the dependence care of the dependency worker, range from like everyone that the dependent ever influences. So if that child grows up to be an adult, or if like the terminally ill patient like is able to somehow like touch other people's lives, like every person who has an interaction with them like is touched by the work of that dependency worker. So everyone benefits. And then she also talks about treating people as ends in themselves, in terms of like the ill or disabled. Like we like are morally mandated to care for them because they have their own ends. It's treating people as ends in themselves instead of just a means to an end, which sounded a little familiar to me. So then she goes into talking about how our equality is based off of our care. We all needed care at one point. We all need to become caregivers. So that's where she draws the line for equality, and saying that we all need to produce some kind of reciprocity in our lives for the care that we've gotten. Everyone should show reciprocity to their full capacity, that including like disabled people like should show reciprocity to their caregivers in the way that they can, in any way that they see fit. And then the last thing that she talks about is family policy. So she talks about how feminized poverty is something that everyone can agree should be changed. It doesn't matter what political party you are, religious belief. Everyone should understand that the rate of women with dependence in poverty is a problem and should change. So then she argues against strengthening nuclear families, which is what we talked about earlier with like emphasizing complementary gender roles and that kind of thing. She says that stigmas have decreased from single-parent homes, and that good male role models can come from degendering the concept of dependency workers. So if more men are in that dependency worker role, then children will have solid male role models or female role models, either or. And then she says that traditional nuclear families discriminate against gay and lesbian families, and how those families still like care about their children and everything like that. So it's not something that should just be focused on one man and one woman. In closing, she talks about her policy regarding gender equality. She says that it should focus on working on changing the rules based on who is the dependency worker. So if you start from there, then all policies about gender equality will like come to terms with themselves. And then it says that to encourage male dependency work would help bring about like gender equality. And dependency work should be compensated and given status as any other legitimate employment would be, because it takes so much out of a person and is basically a full-time job. So she suggests a payment system for that kind of thing, which I found like kind of unconventional and pretty interesting. So I'd love to hear you guys' like final thoughts on her policy argument, whether or not you think that that's feasible, and I look forward to reading all of your comments. Thanks so much.